recommend listening to Kemi Badenoch's advice and intervening when you see someone nicking stuff?
Well, I have a tendency to do this because I'm a bit stupid, I suppose. I intervened on the tube the other day when there was some, not stealing, but some rather vulgar young men whose language was disgraceful. And I actually spoke to them. I said, there's women on this tube and you were frightening them with your disgusting behaviour. What sums up the modern generation? One always said, oh, that's rather sexist. And I said, well, I'm doing what my mother taught me. And once I'd said something, a young African lady said, yeah, he's right, this is disgusting. And an older couple said, yeah, we back you up. And these clowns actually shut up. But sometimes it just needs somebody to say no. But the trouble, what people see, of course, we had the tragic case up in Milton Keynes last month where a security guard intervened and was stabbed because many of these thieves, they've got used to stealing. So the moment somebody says no or tries to stop them, they're pulling out a knife or a dirty needle or something like that. So I suppose I'm one of the stupid ones, but sometimes we've got to do the right thing.
Oh no, I couldn't. I totally agree, but I'd be terrified about doing something. Although I have actually, in my own little way, tried to prevent a shoplifter. When I lived in London, I was coming out of I was in Marks and Spencer on Earls Court Road, and people were coming in, filling up their bags full of like meats and all the rest of it. On the Co-op on Earls Court Road, they actually have to have GPS trackers on the meats, like steaks are in these sort of plastic cases now. Anyway, as the guy was running out of the shop, I thought, well, I can't intervene, but I did stick my foot out, and I did manage to sort of semi-trip him up, but unfortunately he didn't actually fall over, so he carried on his merry way. So there you are. I tried to have my little moment of heroism, unsuccessfully. Let's talk about this absolutely crazy thing, where there's been a trial of live facial recognition cameras. These cameras are basically mounted on top of vans, as I understand. They're designed to identify people on watch lists if they pass by. Essex police has had to pause the use because they say there's potential bias in the positive identification rate, because this equipment was identifying around half of people on the watch list, and it's very rare for someone to be flagged up if they weren't on the watch list, but apparently it was statistically significantly more likely to correctly identify black people than other ethnicities. And they've said, well, we've had to fiddle with the algorithms. What's going on here? Is it just that, look, at the end of the day, there might be a sort of disproportionate representation of certain people committing certain crimes, or is it really that these cameras, for some reason, are just better off identifying black faces than others?
Well, I think it's the latter, what you say. So, yes, there is evidence that different ethnic groups do commit different crimes. I've been on here about stabbings in London and grooming gangs and, white people commit different types of crime. But in this circumstance, it is the bizarre situation that it's been more accurate around black faces. Now, the odd thing is all the criticisms in the past is facial recognition, and you only have to watch at the airport, really. If you stood and watched, it would be not as good at picking out Asian and black faces or women's faces in particular. So it's this really odd situation where they're pulling it for being too accurate. It's not to do with the volume of crime committed by certain groups, but the trouble with all this is, they're stupid, the police, and I've told them this time and time again. They deploy technology, and then they rely on an officer who looks at the screen. So what happens is that the machine, beep, 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 an alarm goes off, and it'll say, look, the person who's coming towards us is one of these, and it'll show an array of 10 faces. And the officer has got to make a decision and say, oh, it's number 5. But we know from research, Professor Davis at Greenwich University has shown that 98% of people are just no good at this. I worked in the police with the Super Recogniser Squad. We have people who never forget face, and they're the people, and Essex Police have got some of these people. Other police, Hertfordshire, use these people. The Met, of course, don't use them. They just give officers a briefing, and it's unfair on the officer who's got to make the choice, because then it's on them that they've made a wrongful arrest. So the situation or the solution is very, very simple, and I've offered to help the police with this, but they're too clever to take it.
I mean, what is the purpose of these? Sort of, if you're sitting there and it pings every time someone's on a watch list, do the police, what happens then? Do they sort of just, I don't know, record where they are? They jump out and arrest them? I don't really understand.
Yes. So what happens, Alex? You've got, so let's say I'm from Bolton. You've got a Bolton Town Centre. There's a lot of scoundrels who are wanted for thieving or robbery. So you put them on the watch list, and you put the camera somewhere where, people are funneled through, like a narrow street or something. And then the computer looks at them and says, oh, that's the guy who's wanted for theft. That's the guy who's wanted for a stabbing or whatever else. And everybody else, it just looks at them and dismisses what's happened. But as I've said, the real problem is who is the person who sits in the back and says, that is the right person. And the other way they get arrested, of course, a lot of the arrests come from the police officers just do normal police work, because some people try and see the camera and they try and dodge it. And so they're obviously worth speaking to because they're up to no good. So a lot of the arrests come from that rather than the technology.
Oh, fascinating stuff. Mike, thank you ever so much for joining us. Mike Neville there, former Met Police detective.